What's it going to take for Canadians to realize that our tax system is outdated, cumbersome, and dysfunctional?
We know what the solution is. This program actually exists.
We would have needed consistent leadership that understands a future state.
We have a government that's literally promising private companies it won't build tools.
There's a fear and a concern that we can't pull this off.
Once you have tried a system that really works, it's transformative.
Welcome to the Functional Government Podcast. Everyone hates tax day, right? Not so fast. Everyone in North America hates it. In many countries, it simply doesn't exist. The reality is that for most people, Canadians and elsewhere, the government already knows what you made. It has your tax documents because deductions are filed by your employer and savings are reported by your bank. In some countries, government sends you a report of the taxes it collected and you just confirm it. In others, you get a tax return that's filled out and add in the sources of income the government doesn't know about. But not here. Here, we get to play an annual game of gotcha, where the government says, we know what you made and what you owe, but you have to tell us, and we're going to check and fine you if they don't match. Income tax is the one place where you're assumed guilty until proven innocent and have to pay someone to defend you. But it gets weirder. You only have to pay taxes if you make over a certain amount, which means poor, homeless, and unbanked people often don't file taxes. Yet you need to file a tax return to claim many of our country's social benefits. You may not be able to do that if, for example, you have no fixed address. So the people least likely and able to file taxes can't get the benefits society offers them. If that seems messed up, it gets even worse. Personal income tax preparation services and software cost Canadians billions a year. And since tax filing is clearly a government responsibility and should be as easy as possible so that everyone pays their taxes, you'd think this would be a government function. But it's not. Canada has partnered with private companies, some of which are foreign-owned, to offer tax software. That software isn't guaranteed to be right. In fact, a disagreement between software and the CRA over Form ON 479A, a childcare expense form, has left some Canadian families with over $10,000 in owed taxes, plus penalties. And a delay in getting payment information from employers means tools like TurboTax and Wealthsimple weren't working properly 2 weeks before tax day. And that's just in 2025. So why hasn't the government tried to build its own tax filing tool, even if it's just an opt-in one that automatically files for our most vulnerable citizens so they can claim their benefits? It tried to. A decade ago, the government's mandate letter promised to fix all this. The Canadian Digital Service worked to build just such a tool. In fact, it's available for everyone to see on GitHub, but it got shelved. The CRA even launched an invitation-only digital filing service to 118,000 people, but only 260 used it. There are plenty of special interest groups who want taxes to remain complicated. In 2018, the CRA, after meeting with the Canadian tax preparation and software industry, a lobby group, the government basically capitulated, saying it had, quote, no plans to make significant changes to the File My Return service over this 3-year monitoring period, unquote. This is a political hot potato, too. As the CBC says, an automatic filing system would result in the government paying out between $1.6 and $1.8 billion to individuals who are not receiving those benefits now. The Functional Government Podcast looks at government services, why they are the way they are in Canada, and what other countries are doing. And there's no other service that touches every Canadian the way personal income tax does. This is a big, complex topic. Many Canadians don't like the idea of the government telling them what they earned, even though it already knows. Politicians love being able to promise benefits that nobody claims. And tax preparation is a multi-billion-dollar industry that can convince politicians to act against citizens' interests. We may see changes to this soon. The platform on which Prime Minister Mark Carney was elected says it will, quote, get Canadians the benefits they deserve by delivering automatic tax filing, starting with low-income households and seniors, end quote, to get Canadians the benefits to which they're already entitled. To learn more about the issue, I spoke with Alexandra MacEachern, who is a senior policy advisor to the Canadian Digital Service, a policy advisor for the Treasury Board of Canada, and chief of staff to Canada's chief digital officer, as well as director of strategic engagement at the Canadian Digital Service. Alex and I were joined by Paul Craig, formerly the lead developer on the CRA team at the Canadian Digital Service and senior technical advisor for Employment and Social Development Canada. Paul worked on public sector procurement as a developer in the UK government's digital service, and Alexandra works with Public Digital, a global digital government consultancy, so both have a good understanding of how income tax works elsewhere in the world, and why, in many of those countries, nobody understands the expression tax season. Thanks for joining us, Alex and Paul. We have a lot of stuff to unpack about how taxes are filed in Canada and elsewhere in the world. Before we dive into that, I want you both to explain who you are and what your experience with the tax services. Alex, why don't you go first?
Sure. So thanks so much for having me, Alistair. I'm Alex MacEachern, and for the last 10 years, I've been with the federal government, both on the political side and then as a bureaucrat within the Treasury Board and specifically within the Canadian Digital Service. Now I'm at Public Digital, and so I feel like I'm able to offer some insights and opinions on the matter because I've seen how government operates, why the tax system is important in general. At the Canadian Digital Service, we also did a partnership with the CRA, so we've seen a little bit about what it can look like to build on the ground and how to serve people directly with some very functional prototypes.
And you have a background in law as well, right?
I sure do, and this is a very legal heavy area, one of the most complex. The Income Tax Act is formidable and large and comes out every year, so definitely the legal expertise explains a lot of why things are the way they are in Canada, but also offers some opportunities for maybe how they could look differently.
Yeah, and we'll get back to why the tax code is so big and changes so much as we move forward. But before then, hi, Paul. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. I, like Alex, worked at the Canadian Digital Service for about 5 years between 2018 and 2024. Before that, I worked in the UK. So you talk about the UK a bit later, but I actually was a recipient of their tax system, which for all intents and purposes, you don't see it ever. But moving back to Canada, working with the Canadian Digital Service, I worked on a project where we tried to facilitate low-income tax filing, kind of automatic low-income tax filing with the CRA, so in partnership with them. And we didn't actually get there, but we did. I learned a lot. We built a prototype. We have our results and findings out in the public, and so I'm kind of familiar with their inner workings and some of how they design and build these services.
And out of the 270 different digital services that Canadians can apparently access online, there are very few services that touch everybody as much as personal tax filing. In 2022, there were about 31.3 million Canadians who filed income tax, not just those who owe taxes, but those who want to claim benefits or refunds, and that takes a ton of time. Alex, why is taxation such a unique function of government?
I love this question, Alistair. So you're right that it's one of the biggest touch points that citizens will have with the federal government. We also don't always think about it this way, but the tax system is one of the most powerful tools that the federal government has to indicate its political priorities and to deliver upon them. So when we think about political priorities, a government might decide to prioritize the middle class, for instance, and we'll see the creation of TFSAs or child tax benefits. They may wish to incentivize green innovation, and we'll see subsidies for green technologies. They may wish to subsidize housing, and then we see new tax incentives for Canadians to save money towards buying their first home. So whenever we set a political priority, one of the first tools in the political tool chest that politicians go to are tax incentives. And what that means is that year over year, that Income Tax Act gets bigger and bigger because we're adding more and more things into it. So it's a really unique tool in that way. Another interesting thing about the tax filing system is that the policies that govern those things are written by the Department of Finance. And we probably know that the Minister for Finance is probably the most senior member of cabinet outside of the Prime Minister. And that's been particularly true in the last few years, where historically, up until quite recently, the Deputy Prime Minister was also the Minister of Finance. So you can see those big political priorities being articulated by the government and then being delivered directly to citizens through the tax filing system.
You also mentioned when we were discussing this earlier, the fact that the tax department is the one place where innocent until proven guilty doesn't apply.
That's true too. So the other, I think, indicator of how powerful this system is what you've just referred to, which is this reverse onus. And you can see it in other aspects of government, but generally speaking, when the federal government accuses you of something, so if we think of a criminal offense, there is a presumption of innocence, and you are usually entitled to legal counsel to help you mount a defense because there's an appreciation that the state has so much power against the individual. However, in the instances of tax filing, the onus is on the individual to prove that they have accounted for all of their earnings, all of their income, that all of the finances is correct. And we don't see the same level of support for individuals who may be accused of having misfiled or have been audited and there have irregularities have been found. You don't see the same protections offered to those individuals. It's a bit of a David versus Goliath situation. And I think it calls back to the other sort of unique part about tax filing, which for many Canadians is this notion that we pay through taxes to create a bureaucracy that is the Canadian Revenue Agency. And then we also often have to pay a third party, and that could be a tax software, that could be H&R Block, that could be a private accountant, but we usually have to pay a third party to then tell that agency a lot of information that they might already know. And if we mess that up, if we miss a decimal point, if we forget something, then the entire power of that agency comes against us, and we're not left with a lot of options to really defend ourselves. The onus is on us to be correct in all instances, or else face a really heavy burden of the CRA coming upon you.
I saw a news article, I think today, about errors in TurboTax filing instructions that meant that now people are having to pay $10,000 in missed and unpaid taxes plus penalties and interest, because a third-party software platform misguided them, and there doesn't seem to be recourse for that. So, Paul, you've lived in the UK and you've obviously studied this. How common is it around the world for people have to file their own taxes or use a third party to do so?
It's really not that common. As I said, when I lived in the UK, there was no tax filing season or it's time to do tax filing. You were getting your paychecks, and then by the end of the year, like nothing changes on tax filing days because this sort of pay-as-you-earn system, you don't see the taxes being filed. It's just kind of happening. And so there's no deadline for you to be aware of or really do anything. If you had your own business or you're, selling lemonade, something like this is income that's not being accounted for, you would have to report that separately. But for a lot of people, I think in the UK, over 50% of people, they probably like in Canada, right? They have a full-time job, they have RSPs, TFSAs. So their source of income is through their job, and they're making these well-known investments. And like CRA actually has access to that information at the point when you're supposed to file. And so in the UK, I guess the assumption is we think that this is what your tax situation looks like, and we're prepared to file on your behalf, assuming that this is the case. If it's wrong, you can correct that. And in Canada, we say, because we can't be totally sure, we can't make any assumptions at all, and so therefore the kind of onus is on you as the taxpayer to provide all that information up front. I saw a good metaphor, which is like, if your credit card company at the end of every month, they didn't show you what you bought, they sent you a blank paper and said, you have to list everything itemized that you bought on every day, and if it doesn't line up, we're going to fine you. This is almost what we are being asked to do by the CRA, right? Like, they have a lot of this information, but we then have to submit it to them.
That sounds like a preposterous state of affairs, particularly since for almost every Canadian, or for the vast majority of Canadians, the T4 and the RRSP and other documents are pretty much what you need to know to figure out what someone earned if you're employed. I've seen estimates that the cost of complying with the tax system and the administrative burden is between 3.5 and 5.8% of all tax revenues collected. It depends on who you're talking to. And obviously there's things like GST and other corporate taxes, but let's focus just on income tax systems. So you mentioned in the UK, the pay-as-you-earn system, which is the thing that just basically withholds taxes from you at the root. In other countries like the Netherlands, you get a tax form that's pre-filled out and you just have to reply going, yes, this is correct, or correct the information on it. And it seems like this is pretty common in Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and so on. Why is it different in Canada? Alex, do you have any insight into how we got this way?
I do. So I'd say firstly that the other, I think, important thing not to lose track of are the consequences of not doing this well. So if you are found to have misled the CRA, you can go bankrupt. Your wages can be garnished. They can seize assets. It's a very serious financial repercussions. And I think because those repercussions are so serious, we have decided culturally and policy-wise to put the onus on the citizen. Now, why I think folks have been perhaps shy to autofile in the past, there are a few policy rationales. So firstly, I think there's a concern that they may get it wrong, and that can be both from a fraud perspective and from just not having the right information. And certainly some folks have much more complicated tax situations than others. You can have dual citizens. Those who are self-employed are going to be more complicated than those with unionized positions and so forth. But I think at its heart, there's just a real anxiety that they will get it wrong. Relatedly, there are some privacy concerns. So I think there's the notion of, well, maybe citizens don't want us to have all this information and they don't want us to do this for them, and it would be a violation of privacy for us to do it on their behalf. The counter argument to that is that folks could opt in, of course, but the initial, I think, reservation is that this is a violation for us to somehow know this information file on behalf of others. And then if we're talking about maybe low income, no income Canadians, I think that there's a concern about what is the threshold for someone on whose behalf we autofile. And certainly those seem to be a very deserving demographic, people who are retired and whose only source of income the government should really have at their fingertips, or folks who are homeless and who are going to tax shelters to file. They seem very worthy of this sort of help. So I think there's a policy concern there about what is the threshold. I think there's also maybe a policy concern that if we automatically granted all of the benefits that we have promised to deliver, do we actually have enough money in the pot? And that might be of particular concern if we think about a pending recession and maybe reviving tax policies such as CERB, which saw incredibly high uptake. If we automatically grant those to all those who are qualified, do we actually have the money to do so?
So this is like when McDonald's does, or Tim Hortons does, like a contest, and they're banking on the fact that only 5% of people will play. If everybody played, they'd go bankrupt, right? You're suggesting that there's a part of, let's not tell people what they are entitled to, because then they'll get those entitlements if they're automatic?
I think so. You would just have to be able to really do the math. And I think built into a lot of benefits is an assumption that folks will not qualify, and relatedly that folks just simply will not apply. But if it's automatic, then you have to assume with big numbers that you'll be doling out a lot of money in those benefits.
For sure. Paul, what are your thoughts on why we have it this way when other countries have a more sensible, more functional version?
I wanted to add some, sort of flesh out some of this, like the automatic tax filing, the idea that you introduced at the beginning, Alistair, about it's being an important service. As a Canadian, you are obligated to file taxes if you owe taxes, right? But not everyone does. So if you don't file, that's not necessarily wrong. We don't know that you actually met the threshold, right? So if I earn under, I think the basic personal amount federally, something like $14,000 a year, goes up and down, but it's around there. If I made $12,000 a year, I don't have to file. The reason that would become a problem for me as somebody who made that salary or that income, would be because we use the tax filing system in order to qualify you for benefits. So some of these rental benefits or the energy benefits, or I'm thinking in Ontario, we have like the on-ben, like the Trillium benefit. Those you have to have filed. Same with the dental benefit, right? The new one. Like you have to have filed to exist in the system in order to qualify for these benefits. From the CRA perspective, like if you owe taxes, like if you made $1 million and then you're hiding it, like they sort of have an obligation to find you in order to receive that tax revenue. But if you don't owe taxes, there's no parallel obligation to go find you, right? And say, okay, you're actually missing these benefits. We need to get you into the system. So part of our research when we were building our system was going to food banks or these places that lower income people would go to where they're offering tax assistance. And what we'd hear a lot from people is like, they didn't file in the past. So they're worried that like now if they file, it's sort of like essentially they'll pop back up in the system and then somebody will show up and say, hey, you're in trouble. You didn't file for 3 years and now you're filing like that. You should have been filing every year. So they're not actually aware that A, you don't have to file, but B, like they're actually missing out on benefits, like likely by having not filed. And more than once we saw people would come in, they're sort of like, I have to file, I've hit some point in my life, like I need to sort this out. And they'd file multiple years at once, and then they'd receive several years worth of benefits and they'd walk out totally stunned, right? Because they sort of thought they were coming in to the gallows. Like I'm here to take my consequences. I've been in lapse of this service I need to provide or this obligation that I have. And they actually find out that they actually receive a lot of benefits. But yeah, so I think the way that Alex frames this around like, do we actually have all the money for this? I think like within the CRA, there's this sense that like if somebody is welshing on their taxes or hiding them, like that's the kind of person we go after, versus if somebody chooses not to file, hey, like they don't have to, right?
When you say when we saw people walking, this is when you were doing research for the CDS to try and understand taxation.
Yeah, so we were trying to build, the CRA currently has a tool, they used to have a sort of phone version of it, and we were trying to build an online version of it. It would be a sort of expedited filing for people with simple tax situations and also unchanging tax situations. The sort of typical idea is somebody who's retired, they're receiving OAS, and they live in the same address.
What is OAS for those of us?
So the old age security benefit is a benefit that you get once you're retired as a Canadian citizen. So if I've been retired for a few years, I've started receiving OAS. So for the past 3 years, maybe I've had the same income. So the government gives me that income, so it knows that it's being sent out. And if I have the same spouse and the same address for 3 years in a row, we can say, then it's very likely that this fourth year I will have the same circumstances. And so therefore, in this case, I would be an ideal candidate for like, I have what they call a simple tax situation, and I have sort of a history of filing the same way multiple years. And so we can make an informed guess that this person will file the same way. And so therefore we can essentially send them a pre-populated form, be it paper, on the phone, or what we were trying to do, like a digital one. So you could sort of log into the system, click through screens, confirm that this is still up to date. Yes, yes, yes. And then by the end you would file. So that's what we were trying to do. And as part of that, we went to a few food banks and other places like this, and we would talk to people who were coming in.
Why were you in food banks?
We were looking to find low-income tax filers. These were our target audience for the service we were trying to build. In Canada, we have a volunteer program called the Community Volunteer Income Tax Program, in which fellow Canadians, right, our peers, can volunteer to help people file their taxes. So you have to meet some criteria. You have to have simple tax scenario and low income, both of which are defined on the CRA's website for this. But essentially, these various charities or community spaces, they'll set up folding tables, they'll have a bunch of volunteers, they'll have laptops open, and if you meet the criteria, you can go in, you can have your taxes filed by a volunteer. And so that was sort of our target audience, people who would be low income and are having trouble filing taxes on their own, and they have sort of pursued or seeked out a volunteer to help them.
So I understand correctly, Canada already has programs so that the underprivileged, unbanked, homeless, people like that, vulnerable parts of our population can file their taxes because you need to file your taxes to claim benefits. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was the primary motivator. A lot of these folks have the information they need to file when they walk in, and they don't feel like they can do it themselves. So it's hard and confusing to go through the tax system, and the solution that we have is you can either pay someone to help you, or we have this like army of volunteers that we mobilize once a year to just like type on a keyboard on behalf of somebody.
Got it. So Alex, if I understand this correctly, just because I'm Canadian and have a social insurance number doesn't get me benefits.
No, it does not.
We talk about the social safety net coming from your social insurance number, but you're telling me that the social insurance number has nothing to do with claiming benefits because that happens through the taxation system.
Well, so your SIN number helps to verify identity, and it will help to link to important other parts of infrastructure, including you can register various bank accounts. But you do have to apply for benefits, and some folks don't want to receive benefits for privacy reasons, for ethical reasons, for moral reasons. But you're correct that we don't do this automatically. We don't do it on your behalf. There are some exceptions to that. They tend to be hyper political, where you just kind of like get a check in the mail for $200. But if you're qualifying for very specific programs that have been set out by the government, you do have to apply. There's a set of criteria. And I think Paul articulated really thoughtfully how that's been operating within the taxation space. Specifically, low-income, no-income Canadians were identified as a priority, and for a number of mandate letters to the Minister for National Revenue, it was called out as a priority area for the government to help out because they were considered underserved.
So when I talk to people about this, they say, oh, no, I use the U-file thing, and in an hour, I've then filed my taxes. And I said, is that a CRA tool? Oh, yeah, that's the free tax filing system. Is that the free tax filing system, Alex?
Oh, I'm going to definitely want to tag team Paul in on this. But I would say it is free in the sense that you don't have to necessarily pay up front. It is not free in the sense of where your data goes is a very valid consideration and concern.
But is it a product of the CRA?
I believe it is a product in partnership with the CRA, but it is with a third party, which is a large American multinational, hence the data question. And make sure that you read your T's and C's, because if you're not paying, you are the product, usually. I would also say that having used that system myself, on almost every screen, there is a disclaimer that you as the tax filer may not be filing your taxes correctly and that you should be paying additional money in order to ensure accuracy. You have slightly more complex issues you cannot file. So I pay Law Society fees, and that deduction alone makes it such that I can't use that particular service without paying additional money.
So let me make sure I get this straight. We'd like to give the vulnerable in our country benefits, but for that, they have to file taxes. But if you earn under a certain amount of money, you're not obligated to file taxes. But then nobody comes looking for you to give you benefits. If everybody claimed the benefits, we might not be able to afford them. And the way to file your taxes for free with the CRA is to use an ostensibly free tool by a foreign-owned third party in partnership with the government. Have I got that right so far?
On the digital side.
On the digital side, you can still do it by paper.
Correct.
We all remember paper. So, and I read a story about tax fraud that was happening where people were filing, they were using filings to claim that they were representative of someone and then filing false claims. There was a nurse in Alberta who was hauled into jail and had mugshots taken for fraud. And it turns out that someone was impersonating her identity because she was using a third-party tool that had been, the data had been found in a data breach, right? Paul?
Yeah, CRA runs the backend system. So CRA offers a page where they say, here's our statistics for tax returns. So for the current one, 2025, they say there's 4 options they list. They say paper, e-file, net file, and simple file.
What are those different? I mean,
So,
I think I know what paper is.
Paper, we got it. Yeah. Net file is if you're using TurboTax, if you're using Wealthsimple, if you're using U-File. If you're on your computer at home and you're filing a return for yourself, that's net file. CRA runs essentially the API. So if you have a weather app on your phone, the data is coming from some computer somewhere else, but whoever makes the weather app is sort of like the Wealthsimple or the Intuit. Like the interface you're seeing is a private company. The data they send is being received by CRA. So CRA doesn't offer like a screen that you can enter data into. You have to use a third party. So that's NetFile. About 1/3 of people do that. Almost 2/3 of people are using e-file. So e-file is like a company doing your taxes for you. So if you go to H&R Block, if you go to an accountant, they are filing on your behalf. And they are a company filer, like they're not just an individual. It's about 60% this year that we see going through e-file means that it's people going to H&R Block, it's people basically having someone do their taxes for them, like a Money Mart, like that kind of thing too. So when you were talking before about the systems people are using or whether it's a multinational, like Wealthsimple is a Canadian company. So if you use Wealthsimple, you're paying a Canadian company, and I guess they have a free product, right? But then they say if you want audit protection, it's $40. If you're using Intuit, that's a U.S. company. But if you go to H&R Block, this is essentially, I don't know how to do it. It's too hard. Somebody else do it for me. And like that's the biggest segment that we see.
Sure. So I looked into this. Canadians spend about $4.2 billion a year annually on personal tax preparation. That's about 0.15% of our entire GDP for the year. And it seems like it's a pay to comply and sort of whack-a-mole if you get it wrong situation. You'd think this would be something we would have modernized a while ago. Like I know in the US, it's $12.2 billion a year in tax preparation. It seems like if other countries have solved this problem and we have this weird model where we know, but we're not going to tell you, so you better file and then we're going to check to see if it's real. And if you make a mistake, we're going to come after you. That seems kind of dysfunctional. And since this is the Functional Government podcast, what are the obstacles to modernizing? Why is it so hard to modernize taxation? Alex?
That's a great question, and I think it's a complex answer. So firstly, it is a huge ship. So CRA is the largest government entity apart from the military. It's 60,000 employees, coast to coast to coast. It is enormous. And so whenever we want to make even a small change, so we want to do better content design on a form, the amount of change behind the scenes that requires is enormous. And that's making sure that when you call the CRA, that the person responding to your phone call has the accurate information, that the website is updated, that the processes are updated. So it's an enormous entity. I would also say that the CRA, because perhaps it is so big, is often looked at as an area for cuts. And one of the places that folks love to cut first are the innovation teams. And that means that it's really challenging for an organization of that size to think 3, 5, 8, 10 years ahead, because the people in charge of that tend to have really underfunded teams or no teams at all. And similarly, I think that both the Department of Finance and the CRA are so consumed in the short term with delivering on these political priorities and with getting the newest tax benefits out the door that they're really not looking ahead. Underpinning all of that is a sort of culture of it has to be on the citizen. We cannot act on their behalf. And when you mentioned earlier, Alistair, this fraud case involving someone filling out taxes on your behalf, that's one of the policy cruxes that I think CRA really relies upon, is like we need it in double underlined bold that someone could possibly touch your tax data on your behalf, and we do not feel empowered to do so, and thus we will not. And culturally, I think there'd have to be a really aggressive shift about sort of more tell us once, and if we can verify that the information is correct. And the onus would still be on the citizen. If you're hiding income, if you're retired but then you win the lottery, if you're retired but you sell a beautiful piece of art, you still have to report all of that. But up until that point, can CRA deliver more proactively? I think that's a cultural shift mixed with a need to focus on the medium to long term instead of the immediate, combined with just the realities of an incredibly large organization that has not historically been teed up to really work this way.
But we could have a checkbox that just says, I authorize the CRA to fill out my tax return and send it to me to look at and see if it's okay.
In theory, sure.
There's nothing like theoretically that is a thing that could happen.
Then the back end needs to line up to that.
Sure. So, Alex, the thing that I don't think we've talked about that's sort of the elephant in the room here is that there are a lot of reasons why some part of the population likes a complicated tax code. I already mentioned like $4.2 billion in personal tax preparation, but it does seem like if you have this Byzantine thing full of loopholes, and you have an army of lawyers and accountants, you can find clever ways to hide your money or, come up with these weird maneuvers of moving things into trusts and so on that benefit the rich, as well as those people who make money from tax providing and filing services and so on. What are your thoughts about why there has been so little political will to fix this stuff?
Ooh, that's a big question. And I would answer this in sort of a party agnostic way. I think that those loopholes are not loopholes. Those loopholes are strategic opportunities, and that they are created and they are maintained so that certain folks will continue to support various elected officials. And if that weren't the case, the Income Tax Act would not be the size of a phone book every year. It would be much leaner. I'd also say that it is complicated legislation, and so it's something that needs to be thoughtfully amended, and there's a real domino effect in this area of law that may not be true in others. So I think that there are absolutely opportunities for the rich to stay richer and for the elected to remain elected in having it be a very complex, complicated, convoluted process. That's sort of unfortunate, but I do think that is the reality. It's also pretty boring. And so it's not something that a lot of people pay attention to. It's not going to make a great campaign slogan. I don't think your average day-to-day person thinks about this. They're just used to the CRA being kind of big and scary, and they deal with their taxes once a year. Hopefully they get a refund, maybe they don't, and that's about it. So we don't really put this front and center as an area for innovation and an area where we could do better. And then every once in a while, we have things like the Panama Papers that come out, and there's, a flash in the pan in the media, and then we don't hear a whole lot else. So there are lots of different ways why that system remains complex, some of them more disquieting than others.
So in 2024, the government announced that auto filing would be made easier for taxes. It's one of many promises like that. Paul, can we accomplish easier filing?
Yeah, I think we see precedents around the world. There's one in California called the Ready Return, which was sending people their pre-filled tax form for them to verify, like a paper form that they would mail back. And it got something like 98% approval when they pulled people who were recipients of this program. So I think with some programs, big thorny issues, how do we approach it, novel situation. With automated tax filing, we have a pretty good idea where we would start and what at least a sort of pilot solution would look like. So it's really about finding the sort of will to implement it. And
so have we ever tried to build something like that, Paul?
Yeah, so we at the Canadian Digital Service, we worked on a project in partnership with the CRA. So we had some members of our team from the Canadian Digital Service, some from the CRA itself, and we were trying to build a online tool. You would get invited to the program. If you qualified, you could file an expedited tax return. I think one of our major issues, I think kind of the major issue really, was that, as Alex was alluding to before, departments are very big. There's a lot of groups within the department. So, we work with a group that works with new software. They're really excited that this is an opportunity to use new software. We talk to maybe the security group. They're really worried that this opens a security hole. We talk to some of the policy folks. They see this as like an opportunity to advance some of the mandate letter commitments. And then we talk to the legal team, and they walk a lot of that back. They're nervous about filing on behalf of people. If I can give you a more concrete example, mandate letters that were given to the mandate letter that was given to the Minister of National Revenue said, and this is a quote, so, ensure that CRA is a client-focused agency that will proactively contact Canadians who are entitled to but not receiving tax benefits, offer to complete returns for some clients, particularly low-income Canadians and those on fixed incomes, whose financial situation is unchanged from year to year. So that says offer to complete returns for some clients, right? Support more Canadians who wish to file taxes using no paper forms. And then point 4 is deliver correspondence and communications that are easy to read.
So that sounds like a pretty clear mandate. Did CDS wind up building anything?
So we, intuitively would think, okay, this is asking for a sort of digital solution that helps low-income tax filers to file. We received a legal opinion from, I think a pre-existing one, from CRA's legal department, right, where they said, legally speaking, it's really dicey to start filing on behalf of people. Someone could have made $10,000 as their income for 10 years, and then this year make $1 million. So we really don't know anything that is going to happen in the future. And how insulting would it be to assume that you made this and maybe you didn't, right? And maybe your spouse has changed and blah, blah, blah. So really saying that for CRA to file on behalf of people, it goes against how we've traditionally viewed this. It's dangerous. It might insult people. And the conclusion was we should deliver brochures to people that let them know that benefits exist, that if they apply for them, they can receive those benefits. But we shouldn't even target those, because that would be, again, assuming that we know something about someone's situation, so we should just broadly mail those out.
Wow.
And so within the department, there's lots of different groups, and they see the mandates in different ways. I think trying to build the coalition of people who are all aligned in the same direction was a thing we struggled with. And, I think what you see is that this mandate letter that seems sort of intuitive, that we, at least we thought that this is the direction, that you could sort of water it down so that it meant like we should mail people flyers,
So,
and
Paul,
yeah.
Did you write code to try and solve this?
Yeah, so we wrote a prototype that you could click through, and essentially what we would show is like the screens that we hoped would be in the service. So it would say, is this your name? Is this your address? We got as far as testing with real Canadians. So we preloaded some of their information into the system. We had a consent form, of course, so they approved this. And then we showed them the service to see if they would be able to use it. And we found like pretty successful results from that people found it simple, they knew what to do, and CRA's existing research had said that people would prefer a digital service rather than a phone service.
But does this code live anywhere? Like, can people go see what you built?
Yeah, so we published our research, and we also published, but our code was open source, so it lives online. You would have to kind of run it yourself, but it's available.
But there's like a GitHub that shows that CDS's simple filing solution that was built for low-income Canadians based on a mandate letter that's just sitting in a repo somewhere.
If you search CDS, SNC, GitHub, you'll find their GitHub page, and if you search for claim tax benefits, you'll find one repo that's documentation and one repo that's the actual code that we wrote. Yeah.
So, Alex, maybe since you've talked a little bit about the legal side of this, why do you think this was shut down? Like, this sounds like it was a good initiative that has had very high support in other countries, that takes us closer to the model the rest of the world is using for vulnerable people and low-income people who would benefit tremendously from access to the social safety net if they could only get on the taxation radar, and it got shut down. Why on earth would we stop this?
So I think there are a couple of different factors there that came into play. So certainly while the United States was doing similar efforts to autofile and make that easier for their citizens, we saw aggressive lobbying efforts from the existing entrenched players who exist within the taxware software filing product space. There's often a knee-jerk reaction from existing commercial players when the government offers to serve people. I think that related to that, unfortunately, CRA can have a reputation for not excelling in this space. And so I think that unfortunately and honestly unfairly, there was a belief that bureaucrats just couldn't possibly do this. And I think that's honestly why it remains undone to this day, is there's a fear and a concern that we can't pull this off, which is doubly unfortunate when you think about how important and how proprietary that data is. If there is ever a space that calls for us to build it in-house and build it well, and we can build it with a thoughtful partnership, but do it yourself, it's really people's tax data. So I would say it's probably that combined with a lack of maintained political will, which harbors back to the point I made earlier, that this is really for those who want to maintain a political mandate that's beyond 3 or 4 years and that really looks to the future. This was the thin edge of the wedge, but we would have needed consistent leadership that understands a future state and that's dedicated to bringing along the culture and the processes required to make it a reality.
It also sounds like this misinformation out there of like, oh, stay out of my life. How dare you ask me questions about myself? But the government already knows that stuff. It's just not showing you it knows it, because it's like, put your head in the ground and pretend you're an ostrich and no one will see the danger. Paul, what do you think are reasons why this didn't happen?
Certainly we heard a lot about TFEC, Tax Filers Empowerment Canada. So as a tax filer, they're empowering you by preventing CRA from building this service. That they had signed, with the minister, they signed a letter saying, okay, we're not going to build this for 3 years. That 3 years has expired.
Wait, there was a letter signed with the minister saying we won't build this stuff?
There was a memorandum of understanding saying like, hey, we're not going to build a digital service around the simple, what is now called simple file.
The private sector made the government sign a letter saying we won't build something for citizens?
They said that they would run a phone service and make the data available for the tax filers. For 3 years, they said we won't build a digital service.
So we have a government that's literally promising private companies it won't build tools.
Well, that's expired now. So
I know, but this is a thing that I wasn't aware of.
It did happen.
It's kind of why I wanted to run this podcast.
It happened. I will say that I like the CRA. I have friends there. I had a good time in the most part. But they do run a service called Simple File. It does let you file, like it is the service we tried to build, right? Like it lets people file automatically. I will say that CBC wrote an article in 2025. In 2023, CRA invited 118,000 people to use it. Of those, 260 people, so out of 118,000, 260 people use the digital option and 350 use the paper option. So very, very low take up here. And on CRA's statistics about income tax filing, who's filing in what way, they do list Simple File as a way that you can file. This year they say 57,000, and in their percentage of total, they say 0% because it's so much lower than all the other methods. So this system does exist. It's invite only, and the take-up rates are extremely low. And I think that, there's sort of a question around, are we promoting this well enough? Is the pie slice of folks that we're picking, is it too small? Questions around like, why is this so low when it seems like a service that in other jurisdictions is very popular and has worked really well?
Well, we're going to go find people who've built it in other countries and try and understand what happened there. But in the very limited time we have left from each of you, what's it going to take for Canadians to realize that our tax system is outdated, cumbersome, and dysfunctional?
So I'd say that if you're listening to this and if you have a bee in your bonnet about it, let someone know. If you're frustrated that you have to pay a third party or you yourself have to tell the government information that they already know, make that a priority for someone. And I would say that if you are an elected official, and especially if you end up being in charge of national revenue, and if you'd like to always have people buy you beers or forever be receiving high fives, make this a political priority because it's a pain, and have it done. And then I would say that if you're within the CRA or if you are in a position to decide on their budgets, don't cut your innovation teams. Have the confidence that you can deliver this on behalf of Canadians. Think further ahead. And be prepared to maintain the really challenging cultural shift that people do want you to serve them proactively, and that it doesn't always have to be the onus on the citizen, that you can show up for them and folks will rejoice.
Paul, since you've lived in multiple systems, what's it going to take for people to realize that people in England don't have to worry about tax day?
I think once you have tried a system that really works, it's transformative. I think that we haven't had that experience in Canada, so a lot of the FUD are, fear, uncertainty, government's not going to do it right, the bureaucrats don't know what they're doing. They sort of hinge on this, they're going to mess it up, right? But certainly when I was involved in this project, people from the CRA were much more worried about the tax filer lobby getting mad at the minister than they were about regular Canadians saying, hey, what if this service doesn't show up? So I would say, similar to what Alex said, if you write a letter to your minister that's kind of hokey, but it, can draw attention on the issue. If you're a journalist, cataloging CRA's Simple File, how is it going, asking questions about it, raising the salience of this issue, continuing to ask about it, because they do have this program, right? So I think it's more, we know what the solution is.
0% adoption, yeah.
We know what the solution is. This program actually exists, and what we need to do is try to make it a success and hopefully not just sort of quietly get rid of it after a few years of saying, hey, we had 0% take up, so it's over.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for being here. It's very hard to focus on this stuff in a sort of centrist way without throwing swords or throwing people under the bus. But it does sound like something that if we can fix it, it's going to help make our government far more functional than it currently is for the one service that almost everybody touches. So really appreciate you being here and shedding some light on this. We're going to go find people from other countries who've solved this problem.
Thanks, Alistair.
Thanks for joining us on the Functional Government Podcast.